My inheritance to my brother. I made sure he could never enjoy it. They thought I wouldn't fight back. When my parents secretly rewrote my grandfather's will, giving my rightful inheritance to my golden child brother, I smiled on the outside, but I was planning my revenge. My brother rushed to buy his dream house and luxury car, flaunting what was meant to be mine. What he didn't know, I had gathered proof of their fraud. I took it all to court. The house, seized. The car, his credit, ruined. And me. I walked away with what was mine, and the satisfaction of watching him lose it all, piece by piece. My name is Cassidy. I'm a 29-year-old woman from a small town in Ohio, and for as long as I can remember, I've been invisible in my own family. Not in the literal sense, of course. I existed. I was there at every dinner, every holiday, every milestone. But in the ways that truly mattered, I might as well have been a shadow. I was the kid people forgot to clap for. The one whose drawings didn't make it to the fridge. The one whose name was barely whispered when praise was handed out. And then there was my brother, Chase. The golden child. The one who could do no wrong, no matter how small his accomplishments or how big his mistakes. Chase could spill juice all over the brand new couch and somehow still be called adorable. I could quietly get straight A's and no one would notice. It wasn't always this stark, but as we grew older, the lines between us deepened like carvings in stone. I remember birthdays that felt more like obligations for my parents. When I turned 10, I got a generic card and a cake that was still half frozen in the middle. The next month, Chase turned 8, and they threw him a massive party at the skating rink with banners, balloons, and gifts piled higher than his head. He had a cake shaped like a soccer ball because he'd played one game of Pee Wee soccer. I watched him blow out his candles while everyone cheered, and I wondered quietly if anyone had even heard me when I blew out mine. That was how it always went. Chase won a participation ribbon at the science fair. He was a genius in their eyes. I placed first in the district spelling bee. Barely warranted a passing mention at dinner. When I made honor roll, my mom would smile politely and go right back to talking about Chase's weekend plans. When he scraped through his classes with C's, they'd gush about how well-rounded he was, how academics didn't define success. It wasn't that I hated him. I didn't. I pitied him in a way. I knew he wasn't a bad person, just someone raised to believe the world would always bend in his favor. But that didn't ease the sting of being overlooked year after year. There was only one person who truly saw me, my grandfather. Grandpa Henry was the kind of man who paid attention. He didn't just hear what you said. He listened. When I told him about my dream of becoming a writer, he didn't nod absently like my parents. He asked me what I wanted to write about, who my favorite authors were, and how I planned to make it happen. He bought me notebooks and pens, and he read my little stories as if they were bestsellers. Grandpa Henry had grown up with little, worked hard his entire life, and built a small but comfortable fortune. And as I got older, he made his intentions clear in quiet conversations between just us. He wanted me to have the inheritance one day, not because he loved me more than Chase, but because he believed in what I could do with it. "You'll use it wisely, Cassidy," he'd say, resting his hand on mine. "You'll make it grow, you'll make something of it." Those moments kept me going during the hardest times. When I felt like I didn't belong in my own family, I'd remember his words, his faith in me. It was a promise, one I held close, one that reminded me I wasn't invisible to everyone. But in our family, there was an unspoken rule. Loyalty came before fairness, before truth, before individual dreams. You didn't speak up about the unfairness. You didn't rock the boat. And I didn't for a long time. I kept my head down, I worked hard, and I waited. Waited for the day when maybe, just maybe, I'd finally be seen. So, if you like the story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps to grow our channel and it motivates me to make more interesting stories for you. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what's your local time right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. I spent years watching from the sidelines as Chase was handed the spotlight. Every time I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment someone noticed me, I was proven wrong. I learned to stop hoping for applause that would never come. Instead, I focused on my future. College scholarships, side jobs, saving every dollar I could. All the while, I held tight to Grandpa Henry's promise, believing in the quiet justice of it. Family dinners were the worst. Chase would talk about his latest scheme, a failed startup idea, a new car he wanted, some wild party he'd been to, and my parents would beam at him like he'd just announced he cured cancer. I could have discovered a new planet and they wouldn't have looked up from their plates. But Grandpa would lean over and ask me about my latest short story. His eyes warm and kind, reminding me I mattered. I didn't resent my grandfather for loving us both. But I always felt like he was the only one who truly saw what was going on. And maybe that's why he made me the promise he did. He knew I needed it, not just financially but for my soul, for my belief in fairness. The promise of that inheritance wasn't about greed. It was about security. It was about knowing that after years of being overlooked, I'd have a foundation to build my dreams on. It was about the hope that one day all my quiet work would be acknowledged, not in words but in action. But as you'll see, sometimes the people you think you can trust the most are the ones who will break your heart the deepest. And sometimes the quiet, forgotten one has more power than anyone ever imagined. And that's where my real story begins. The morning my grandfather died, the world felt like it tilted on its axis, and nothing ever quite straightened out again. It was one of those clear autumn days in Ohio, where the sky was too blue and the air was too crisp, as if nature hadn't gotten the news that something irrevocable had changed. I remember standing in my tiny kitchen, still in my worn pajamas, staring at my phone as my mom's voice delivered the words that I had dreaded but never truly prepared for. Grandpa Henry was gone. Just like that. A heart attack in his sleep. Peaceful, they said. As if that softened the blow. I sat down on the floor right there, my back against the cabinets, the cold linoleum pressing through the fabric of my pants. I couldn't cry at first. My mind raced through memories. His laugh, his hands weathered from decades of work, the way he'd ruffle my hair and call me kiddo. I thought of all the times I should have visited more often, should have stayed longer on the phone. Grief settled on me like a weight, slow and crushing, making it hard to breathe. The days that followed felt like a blur, but certain moments are etched in my memory like scars. The funeral was a cold affair, not in temperature but in feeling. The church was filled with faces I barely recognized, neighbors and distant cousins, all murmuring their rehearsed condolences. I stood near the casket, staring at the man who had been my safe place, now motionless. His features too still, too unfamiliar in death. I thought I'd break apart, but I held myself together, mostly because no one else seemed to be falling apart. My parents, dressed in black like they were playing a part in a community theater production, didn't shed a tear. They were too busy talking to the attorney, coordinating with the funeral director, making sure the reception had enough trays of cold cuts. My brother, Chase, spent most of the service scrolling on his phone, glancing up only when someone important approached to offer a handshake or a pat on the shoulder. I kept waiting for someone to crack, for the grief to catch up to them the way it had swallowed me whole. But it didn't. Their focus wasn't on mourning the man who had held our family together. It was on what came next. The house, the accounts, the assets, as my father called them with a detached practicality that made my stomach churn. After the service, when the guests had trickled out and the last of the coffee urns had been emptied, I found myself alone at Grandpa's grave. I knelt down, pressing my palm against the cold stone that marked his name, the dates bookending a life that had meant so much to me. I whispered a promise that I would make him proud, that I would use what he left me to build the life he believed I could have. It wasn't long before the talk of the will surfaced. I hadn't thought much about it in the first few days. I was too wrapped up in my sorrow. But I remembered our conversations, the times Grandpa had assured me, in his gentle, thoughtful way, that he wanted me to have security, that he'd made arrangements to ensure I could chase my dreams without fear. So when my parents invited me over a week after the funeral to go over some family matters, I felt a small, fragile hope beneath my sadness. Maybe this was the moment when, for once, I wouldn't be invisible. When something would finally go my way. We sat around the kitchen table at my parents' house, the same table where I'd endured so many meals in silence, listening to them sing Chase's praises. My father cleared his throat and launched into it without much preamble. The will had been updated, he said. Grandpa had changed his mind shortly before his passing. Everything, the house, the savings, the investments, had been left to Chase. I blinked, sure I'd misheard him. But no, my mother nodded in agreement, her expression unreadable. Chase tried to look somber, but I could see the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He'd always gotten what he wanted, and now he'd won the biggest prize of all. I felt like the ground had dropped out beneath me. My voice, when it came, was small, trembling. But, Grandpa said. I trailed off because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd trusted in his word. I'd believed in it more than anything. My mother waved a hand, as if brushing away a speck of dust. Cassidy, it was his final wish. There's no point dredging this up. Let it go. He wanted to take care of Chase. He saw that Chase needed the support more than you. The words hit harder than any slap could have. I needed the support more than Chase. Did they really believe that? I thought about all the times I'd scraped by, working 2 jobs, taking night classes, saving every penny. Chase, meanwhile, had coasted, relying on handouts, bad decisions forgiven before the ink was dry. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile, the kind I'd perfected over the years, the smile that hid the storm raging inside. I nodded, pretending to understand, pretending to accept it. But in that moment, something shifted in me. I began to see things more clearly. My parents' calculated coldness, Chase's smug entitlement. And beneath all that, the cracks in their story. The dates didn't line up. The way they spoke about the will was too rehearsed, too defensive. I started to remember little details. A conversation I'd overheard between my mother and grandfather that contradicted what they were telling me now. So I did what I'd learned to do best. I watched, listened, paid attention. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I knew it would do no good. Instead, I tucked away every piece of information they let slip. I began asking careful questions, framing them as innocent curiosity. I began piecing together the puzzle of what had really happened. Grief still weighed heavy on me, but now it was joined by something else. A determination I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't going to let this go, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. The betrayal. The erasure of my grandfather's true wishes. The final, unforgivable slight in a lifetime of being overlooked. They thought I would fade into the background like I always had. But they didn't see the storm they'd just unleashed. If there was ever any doubt about how my brother Chase would handle being handed my grandfather's entire estate, it didn't last long. Within days of the will being settled, Chase morphed from the golden child into something far less subtle. A man on a victory lap, parading his newfound wealth like a peacock in mating season. And the worst part was, nobody seemed the least bit surprised. It started small, the way these things do. A post on social media. Chase, grinning beside a brand new luxury SUV, the kind that gleamed so brightly in the sun it hurt to look at it. The caption was simple, casual, as if he hadn't just dropped a small fortune on a car he didn't need. Finally treated myself. Grandpa would have wanted this. That stung. Not just because he invoked Grandpa's name, but because I knew exactly what Grandpa would have wanted. And it wasn't this. From there, the posts came faster, bolder. Photos of fancy dinners in restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance. Shots of him in designer clothes, tagged with hashtags like #blessed and #livingmybestlife. I watched in quiet disbelief as my brother reveled in the spoils of a legacy he hadn't earned. He had no shame, no hesitation. It was as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he wasn't going to waste a second of it. The parties followed soon after. At first, small gatherings with his friends, the usual suspects I remembered from high school, the ones who always seemed to orbit Chase, drawn in by his charm or maybe by the trail of destruction he left behind. But the gatherings grew. Weekends became an endless parade of loud music, laughter that rang out into the night, and cars lined up and down the street. I'd hear from old neighbors or distant cousins who had stumbled across the chaos. "Your brother really knows how to throw a party," they'd say, not realizing how their words felt like tiny cuts. The final blow came when he announced, with great fanfare, that he was buying a house. Not just any house, the house. The one I'd spoken to Grandpa about for years. The house I'd dreamed of one day owning. A beautiful old Victorian on the edge of town. The kind with creaky floors and bay windows that looked out over the river. It needed work, but I'd always seen its potential. I'd walked past it so many times, imagining where I'd place my desk, the corner I'd turn into a reading nook, the garden I'd finally learned to tend. I had confided that dream to Grandpa during one of our last long talks on his porch. He'd squeezed my hand and told me I'd get there, that I was patient and thoughtful, and that people like me always found a way. And now here was Chase, grinning in front of that house with a real estate agent at his side, keys dangling from his fingers. Another photo on social media, another caption that made my blood boil. "Home sweet home. Thanks, Grandpa." The whispers began soon after. You can't spend that kind of money that quickly in a small town and expect people not to notice. Family, friends, neighbors, even people I barely knew started commenting on how lucky Chase was, how generous Grandpa had been. But I could see the flicker of something else in their eyes. Doubt, maybe. Suspicion. How had Chase come into so much so fast? It didn't add up, not to people who'd known our family as long as they had. I listened. I nodded politely. And I began to pay attention. It started with small details, the things most people wouldn't think twice about. The date on the will, it was just a few weeks before Grandpa passed, but I remembered visiting him then. He'd been tired, yes, but sharp as ever. He talked about the future, about his plans, about me. Could he really have changed everything so suddenly? I remembered conversations, ones I hadn't thought important at the time, where my parents had mentioned meeting with Grandpa's attorney. Back then, I'd assumed they were helping him with errands, as they often did. Now I wasn't so sure. I started asking questions, careful not to raise alarm. I visited the attorney's office under the pretense of needing copies of paperwork for family records. I asked about the process, about witnesses, about how such decisions were finalized. The answers didn't sit right. There were gaps, things that didn't align with what I knew of Grandpa's habits and character. I spoke to family friends who had been close to Grandpa in his final months. Gently, cautiously, I asked if they'd ever heard him mention updating his will. Most looked puzzled. One or two outright shook their heads. He always said Cassidy would be just fine with what he was leaving her, one old neighbor told me, her brow furrowed. All the while, I watched Chase from a distance. I watched him pour money into that house, hiring contractors for unnecessary renovations, adding flashy details that clashed with the home's charm. I watched him throw lavish parties on the front lawn, turning that quiet street into a circus. He didn't care about the house. He didn't care about preserving its history, or about building a future in it. To him, it was just another trophy. Every social media post, every bragging conversation I overheard, every careless display, I took mental notes. Quietly, methodically, I began collecting screenshots, saving messages, jotting down dates and details. Not because I planned anything in that moment. Not because I wanted to ruin him, but because something in my gut told me I needed to. My parents, for their part, acted as if none of this was happening. They praised Chase at every opportunity, gushed about his good fortune, marveled at his good sense for investing in property. It was as if they had convinced themselves that this version of events was the truth, that Grandpa had truly intended for Chase to have it all, and that I, as always, should simply smile and stay silent. But this time I didn't. I stayed quiet, yes. But I didn't stay still. I didn't stay blind. Because as I watched Chase burn through the inheritance, as I watched him squander what was meant to be a legacy, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth had a way of surfacing. And when it did, I would be ready. First, I thought maybe I was imagining it. That sick feeling in my gut every time I saw Chase flaunt his new fortune, every time my parents spoke about him with stars in their eyes, every time I looked at the keys to that house, the house I'd once dreamed of, and knew they'd never been meant for him. I told myself I was grieving, that I was angry and lost, and maybe I was just looking for someone to blame. But as the days turned into weeks, that feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger. It whispered to me at night, keeping me awake as I stared at the ceiling. Something isn't right. Something isn't right. I started with the little things. Dates. I remembered so clearly visiting Grandpa the week my parents claimed the will had been changed. He'd been tired, yes, but he'd sat with me on the porch, talking about the future. We'd talked about the house, the Victorian with the creaky floors, and he'd said, "That'll be yours one day, Cassidy. Can see you in it. I want that for you." He was clear. He was sharp. He hadn't mentioned Chase. He hadn't mentioned changing his mind. That conversation had taken place only days before the so-called new will was signed. Could he really have changed his heart so completely in the span of a few nights? Didn't sit right with me. Grandpa wasn't impulsive like that. He didn't make big decisions on a whim. I went to the courthouse under the pretense of requesting a copy of the will for my personal records. The clerk handed me a file, and I remember my hands trembling slightly as I took it. I found a quiet corner and began to read. The document was clean, official-looking, but something about it felt off. The signature. It was Grandpa's, sure, but it was shaky, uneven. I'd seen his handwriting just days before he died in notes he'd written me. This signature didn't match the firm, deliberate strokes I knew so well. And the witnesses. Their names were unfamiliar. I recognized one, my father's golf buddy. The other was someone I didn't know at all. No long-time lawyer. No family friend who'd known Grandpa for decades. Just two men with no ties to Grandpa beyond their connections to my father. I felt the first rush of certainty then. I wasn't imagining things. I went to visit Mr. Laird, Grandpa's old attorney. I hadn't seen him at the funeral, which struck me as strange, since Grandpa had always spoken highly of him. He greeted me kindly but cautiously, as if he'd been expecting me. I could tell he already knew why I was there. We sat in his office, the air heavy with the smell of old books and dust. I told him I'd come looking for clarity, that I wanted to understand what had happened with the will. He listened, hands folded on his desk, eyes steady on mine. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Cassidy, I was there when your grandfather signed his will. And that is not the document I saw him sign." I stared at him, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear myself think. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Your grandfather was very clear about his wishes. He'd drawn up that will years ago, and he never wavered on it. He left the majority of his estate to you. He said he'd discussed it with you, that you understood why." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "I don't know what happened after that, Cassidy," he continued, voice heavy with regret. "But something isn't right. I was never contacted about a new will. If he changed it, he didn't do it through me." I left his office in a daze, the weight of his words sinking into my bones. I thought about the signature again, the odd witnesses, the timing. A will signed by a tired old man in his final days, with no trusted attorney, no family friend to oversee it. Just my father's golf buddy and a stranger. And then it hit me. The twist I hadn't wanted to see, but that felt as obvious as the sun in the sky once I acknowledged it. All this time, I told myself Chase was just the beneficiary of my parents' scheming, that he was clueless, caught up in the whirlwind of their favoritism. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. The way he'd moved so fast, securing loans, buying the house, spending the money like it burned his hands. As if he'd been waiting for it. As if he'd known it was coming. The way he'd looked at me that day at the kitchen table, when my parents told me about the new will. There'd been something in his eyes. Not guilt, not surprise, satisfaction. Had he known? Had he been part of it? The idea made my stomach turn, but the evidence was stacking up, undeniable. I started documenting everything, methodically and quietly. I went back to the courthouse, pulled records, made copies. I tracked down the witnesses listed on the will. My father's friend claimed he barely remembered being asked to sign something for Grandpa. Said it was just a favor. The other man was harder to reach, but when I did, he was vague, uncomfortable. I revisited Grandpa's house, now empty, the furniture covered in sheets, the air thick with the smell of dust and memory. I found his old journals, notes he'd written me, all filled with the same steady handwriting I'd always known. I compared them to the will's signature again and again, each time more certain that something was terribly wrong. And through it all I watched Chase. I watched him throw parties, pose for photos, flash his wealth like a badge of honor. And I waited. Because I knew this trail, no matter how well they tried to hide it, would lead to the truth. And when it did, they'd never see me coming. The nights blurred together as I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by papers, old records, and my laptop screen glowing like a harsh spotlight in the dark. Sleep became a stranger to me. Every time I tried to rest, my mind kept turning, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle I had uncovered. The deeper I dug, the clearer the betrayal became. But so did the weight of what I was about to do. It's strange, the way your heart can ache for people who've hurt you so deeply. There were moments I sat there at 2 a.m, staring at my parents' handwriting on old birthday cards, or photos of us together at some long-ago family vacation, and wondered if I was the villain for what I was planning. Guilt twisted in my stomach. I wasn't raised to challenge family. I wasn't raised to bring shame on my blood. But hadn't they already done that? Hadn't they been the ones who broke the unspoken bonds first? And still I hesitated. Because no matter how justified I felt, this wasn't just about money. This was about destroying the image of a family I had tried for so long to believe in. This was about exposing truths that would leave scars. And once the truth was out, there'd be no going back. No holidays spent together pretending everything was fine. No easy smiles over dinner. This would change everything. But the rage, that's what kept me going. The rage at being dismissed, at having my future stolen, at the arrogance with which they believed I would simply fade into the background while they celebrated their theft. Every flashy car Chase drove, every party photo he posted, every smug smile from my parents fueled my determination. They hadn't just taken money. They'd taken the promise my grandfather made to me. They'd trampled on his memory. I started quietly gathering everything I could. I requested bank records under the pretense of helping with the estate paperwork, pretending I was tying up loose ends. I pored over transactions, tracing how quickly the accounts had been drained, where the money had gone. Large sums transferred to Chase's accounts. Funds funneled into the purchase of his house, his car, his renovations. I documented it all, creating a timeline that showed the rapid depletion of Grandpa's estate in the weeks after his death. I searched through old emails, texts, letters, anything that could help build the case. I found messages between my parents and Chase, messages where they discussed finalizing the paperwork and getting things settled before anyone starts asking questions. The language was vague, but the intent was there if you looked closely enough. It was like they thought I'd never bother to look, like they were so sure of my silence they didn't even try to cover their tracks. One night, as I was going through a box of my grandfather's belongings that my parents had carelessly given me to sort through, I found something I hadn't expected. It was an old digital recorder, one Grandpa used to dictate notes and reminders for himself when his hands were too tired to write. I almost set it aside, thinking it was just filled with grocery lists and to-do items. But something made me press play. What I heard nearly stopped my heart. At first, it was just the sound of Grandpa's voice, warm and familiar, as he talked through small things, reminders to call so-and-so to refill his prescriptions. But then, one file started differently. It wasn't Grandpa speaking. It was my parents. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. The recorder must have been left on by accident, capturing a conversation they never meant anyone to hear. "We have to do this for the good of the family," my mother said. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was resolve in it. "Henry doesn't know what he's doing anymore," my father replied. "He's old, he's confused. He thinks leaving it to Cassidy is what's best, but it's not. Chase can handle it. Chase will take care of it. We'll make sure it's handled quickly, before anyone can question it." I sat there in stunned silence, listening to them plan, to them justify their betrayal in the name of family. The recording crackled and ended, but its damage was done. I replayed it over and over, my hands shaking each time. There it was. The proof I hadn't dared hope for. The confirmation that this hadn't been some misunderstanding or last-minute change of heart by my grandfather. This had been a calculated, deliberate fraud. I took that recording and everything else I'd gathered to an attorney, one I trusted, one far removed from my parents' circle of influence. I laid out the bank records, the forged will with its questionable signatures, the timeline of transactions, and finally, that recording. The lawyer listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and at the end of our meeting, looked me in the eye with a seriousness that both terrified and comforted me. "You have a case," he said. "A strong one. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy. They'll fight. It'll get ugly. But if you want to move forward, we can." I walked out of his office feeling the weight of that decision settle on my shoulders. The legal plan was coming together. There would be filings, subpoenas, hearings. My family would be dragged through it all, their secrets laid bare. And me. I'd be the one who put the match to the bridge. But as I looked up at the sky outside, the sun setting behind the buildings, casting everything in gold and shadow, I felt something else too. Felt Grandpa with me. I felt his voice in my ear, reminding me of who I was, of what was right. And I knew deep down that I wasn't destroying my family. They had done that themselves. I was just bringing the truth into the light. And this time I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. The envelope was thick and official-looking when it left my attorney's hands. It carried the weight of every sleepless night, every tear I'd shed in secret, every quiet moment I'd spent gathering the truth while they laughed, celebrated, and counted what wasn't theirs. That envelope was my first blow. It was the storm they never saw coming. And once it was delivered, there was no going back. I'll never forget the call that came after it landed on their doorstep. My mother's voice, tight with panic and fury, crackled through the phone. "Cassidy, what have you done?" she hissed, as if I'd committed some unspeakable sin. "How could you humiliate us like this? After everything we've done for you?" The gall of it nearly made me laugh. After everything they had done for me, the betrayal, the theft, the lies spun so easily they probably believed them themselves by now. But I didn't rise to her bait. I let her rant, her voice rising, filled with desperation. She tried every trick in the book. Guilt, anger, shock. When that didn't work, she switched to sadness, as if she were the victim. "You're tearing this family apart, Cassidy. Don't you see that?" I did see it. But it wasn't me holding the knife. My father called next. His voice was steadier, colder. "You'll regret this," he warned. "We're family. This is private. You think dragging this into the courts is going to fix anything? It'll just ruin all of us. You included." But what they didn't understand was that they'd already ruined it. There was no going back to Sunday dinners and polite conversation. The moment they rewrote my grandfather's final wishes, they'd burned the bridge between us. I was just making sure they felt the heat. And Chase, oh Chase. He didn't call. He didn't text. He posted a vague, self-pitying status on social media about betrayal and being stabbed in the back by those you love. The comments flooded in with sympathy from people who didn't know the full story. People who only saw the image of the charming, successful young man who'd had his life turned upside down. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The truth was already in motion, and soon enough, the world would see it. The day we walked into court for the first hearing, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, heart pounding, palms sweaty, but more certain than I'd ever been. My lawyer spoke with quiet authority as we presented the case. The forged will, the questionable witnesses, the suspicious transactions, the recording of my parents discussing their scheme. Each piece of evidence laid bare their deception. Each word spoken in that courtroom chipped away at the image they'd so carefully built over the years. My parents sat stone-faced at their table, but I saw the cracks in their armor. My mother's hands clenched so tightly around her pen I thought it might snap. My father's jaw twitched. His gaze fixed anywhere but on me. Chase looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. His usual swagger replaced by something smaller, meaner, fear. The details of the fraud spilled out into the public record. There was no hiding behind closed doors anymore. Neighbors, friends, people who'd known our family for years sat in the gallery or read about it in the local paper. The whispers started almost immediately. The perfect family, the ones who always seemed to have it all together, they weren't so perfect after all. I heard the murmurs when I walked out of court that day. People who'd once smiled at my parents with admiration now looked at them with thinly veiled judgment. People who'd once envied Chase's good fortune now saw it for what it was. Stolen. The legal wheels turned quickly after that. The judge, seeing the strength of our evidence, ordered an immediate freeze on Chase's assets. His accounts were locked, his house and car tied up in litigation, the flow of money that had once seemed endless now cut off. I saw the moment it hit him, saw the panic flicker in his eyes. The parties stopped. The flashy posts vanished. The friends who'd flocked to him when the drinks were flowing and the bills were paid began to disappear too. And through it all I kept my head high. Not because it was easy. No. There were moments I wanted to cry, moments I wanted to scream, moments I wanted to run from it all. But I didn't. I stayed. I fought. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about righting a wrong. It was about honoring my grandfather's memory, and the promise he made to me. Every hearing brought more truths to light. Every document filed, every witness called, every word spoken in that courtroom peeled back another layer of their betrayal. And with each layer, the reputation they'd worked so hard to build crumbled a little more. In the end, they'd thought I would stay silent. They'd thought I would swallow my pain and let them have their way, as I had so many times before. But they were wrong. This time I had found my voice. And I was using it to make sure they finally faced the consequences of what they had done. I don't think I'll ever forget the morning I heard about the foreclosure notice. It came as a whisper at first, one of those small-town tidbits that travels faster than wildfire, a hushed conversation overheard in the bakery, a curious glance from a neighbor at the gas station. The grand Victorian house that Chase had paraded around like a crown jewel was under threat. The dream home, the one I'd once imagined as my sanctuary, now stood as a symbol of his greed and hubris, crumbling beneath the weight of truth. It wasn't long before it became more than a whisper. The notice went up. The word spread. The bank had come knocking, and Chase, stripped of his ill-gotten wealth, could no longer keep up with the payments on the mortgage he never should have had in the first place. I drove past that house one afternoon, slow enough to see the overgrown lawn, the cracked paint on the porch, the windows that had once gleamed now smudged with dust. It was strange seeing it like that. A part of me ached, not for Chase but for the house itself. For the future I'd pictured there, the one my grandfather had wanted for me. Chase's fall from grace didn't stop there. The luxury car, the one he'd been so eager to flaunt, didn't stay in his driveway for long. One gray, drizzly morning, a tow truck pulled up in front of his house. I happened to be walking to the corner store when I saw it, the driver stepping out, clipboard in hand, the engine humming as the vehicle was hitched up. Chase came out of the house like a storm, shouting, pleading, threatening. But the man doing his job barely flinched. The car was hooked, lifted, and gone before Chase could do more than hurl a few empty curses at the retreating taillights. People noticed. How could they not? The same neighbors who'd nodded approvingly as Chase roared down the street in that car now watched from behind curtains, from their porches, from the sidewalk where they pretended to tend flowers or check their mail. No one said a word to him. No one offered comfort. And me. I remained steady. In public I was calm. When people asked, I didn't gloat. I didn't spread gossip. I met their questions with quiet dignity. A small smile, a simple statement that the truth had its own way of coming out. That seemed to infuriate Chase more than anything else. He wanted me to lose my temper. He wanted me to act out so he could point and say, "See? She's the problem." But I didn't give him that. The pressure didn't stop with Chase. My parents, who'd stood so smugly beside him when this all began, started to feel the walls closing in too. The legal fees mounted. The cost of defending themselves against the mountain of evidence I'd built wasn't just financial. It was social. Invitations stopped arriving. Old friends stopped calling. The image they'd worked so hard to craft of the perfect upstanding family was now riddled with cracks, and everyone could see through them. Their bank accounts drained faster than they could refill them. My father, once so confident in his retirement plans, started talking about tightening our belts to anyone who'd listen. My mother, who'd once prided herself on charity committees and country club luncheons, withdrew from public life almost entirely. I kept my distance but watched it all unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a sense of inevitability. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about consequences. They had built an empire on sand, and the tide had finally come in. Then came the twist none of us saw coming. It happened during one of the court proceedings, as we prepared to call our next witness. A young man walked into the room, someone I hadn't seen in years, but whose face was burned into my memory. Jason. Once one of Chase's closest friends. They'd been inseparable growing up, thick as thieves, until Jason had quietly drifted away sometime after college. I never knew why. Jason took the stand, swore his oath, and then he told the truth that shattered whatever was left of Chase's defense. He spoke about late-night conversations with Chase in the days before Grandpa died. About how Chase had confided in him, bragged even about how things were being handled. About how he knew the will was being changed, that he was going to come out on top, that it was for the best because, in his words, Cassidy wouldn't know what to do with that kind of money anyway. I watched Chase's face as Jason spoke. The color drained from it, his mouth tightening into a thin, angry line. He avoided looking at his former friend, but there was no escape from the words filling the room. Words that proved Chase hadn't been an innocent pawn. He'd been complicit. He'd known, and he'd gone along with it willingly, eagerly. Jason finished his testimony, his voice steady, his conscience clear. I caught his eye as he stepped down from the stand, and in that moment, I saw something that felt like closure. An old ally, one I hadn't known I had, stepping forward when it mattered most. When court adjourned that day, the silence between Chase and our parents was deafening. The weight of the truth had settled fully on them now, undeniable and crushing. The empire they'd built on lies, favoritism, and fraud was no longer just crumbling. It was in ruins. And there was no one left to blame but themselves. I walked out into the afternoon sun, the air clear and crisp. I felt lighter, as if I could finally breathe again. Not because I'd won, not yet, but because the truth had finally come out. The cracks had become chasms, and there was no papering over them now. And as I stood there, I knew this wasn't just about an inheritance. It never had been. It was about justice. About standing up after a lifetime of being overlooked, and saying enough. The empire had fallen, and I was still standing. The final day in court felt surreal, as though I were watching my life unfold from outside my body. I sat there, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady my breath as the judge reviewed the evidence one last time. Papers rustled. The soft hum of voices echoed faintly through the chamber. The air seemed heavier than usual, thick with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the lies, the pain, the long nights of fighting not just for what was mine, but for the truth. Chase sat across the room. His usual confident smirk nowhere to be found. He looked tired. Hollow. His suit was still expensive. His hair still carefully styled, but there was no hiding the cracks beneath the surface. The house he had boasted about, the house that was supposed to be his forever, was gone. Foreclosed. The car repossessed. His friends had melted away one by one, like shadows at sunrise. His credit was in shambles, his reputation shattered. And worst of all for him, the town that once admired him now whispered behind his back. My parents sat beside him, pale and silent. The wear of the months-long battle was plain on their faces. The legal bills, the public shame, the realization that their scheme had failed so spectacularly, it all clung to them like a second skin. The people they had tried so hard to impress, the image they had worked so long to protect, it was gone. The judge's voice brought me back to the present, firm and clear as he delivered the verdict. He spoke of the evidence. The forged will, the suspicious witnesses, the damning recording, the testimony of Jason, a voice from Chase's past that had revealed far more than Chase had ever wanted the world to know. The judge spoke of trust broken, of a clear intent to deceive, of a scheme that had robbed me of what was rightfully mine. And then, finally, the words I had been waiting for, words that made my heart pound so loud I could barely hear the rest. The inheritance was restored. My grandfather's true wishes were honored at last. The estate, what remained of it after Chase's reckless spending, would come to me. The house, the accounts, the small collection of valuables my grandfather had cherished. All of it. What should have been mine from the beginning. For a long, silent moment after the verdict was handed down, no one moved. I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now. I wanted to be strong, to stand tall, to show them all that I had never needed to stoop to their level to win. I didn't look at Chase right away. I didn't need to. I could feel the waves of devastation rolling off him, the way his world collapsed in on itself. Everything he'd stolen, everything he'd used to prop up his image, was gone. And he knew, as surely as I did, that it was his own choices that had led him here. When I finally did glance his way, I saw him staring at the table in front of him, jaw clenched, eyes shining with the tears he wouldn't allow to fall. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his own actions had finally pressed him down. My parents, they couldn't even meet my gaze. My mother's shoulders trembled slightly, whether from anger or shame, I couldn't tell. My father sat rigid, as though sheer force of will could stop the walls from closing in. But they were already closed. The courtroom emptied slowly, people filing out quietly, glancing our way with curiosity, some with pity, some with a sense of satisfaction that justice had been done. I gathered my things, thanked my attorney, and stepped out into the sunlight. The air smelled fresher than it had in months. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in what had unfolded, only relief and a bittersweet sense of peace. I had fought for what was right and I had won, but at what cost? The family I'd once longed to be part of had revealed itself for what it truly was. There was no putting those pieces back together. I chose peace that day. I chose to move forward. But I also chose boundaries, firm and unyielding. I didn't want their apologies, their explanations, their guilt trips. I didn't want to hear about their regrets, their excuses, their justifications. The door to that part of my life was closed. Chase tried, of course. A week after the verdict, he showed up at my door. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes rumpled, his usual polish gone. He stood there, hands stuffed in his pockets, shifting from foot to foot like a child caught doing something wrong. "Cassidy," he started, voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I let him speak. I listened as he stumbled through an apology, or something that tried to sound like one. He talked about pressure, about expectations, about how he'd gotten swept up in it all, how he never meant for it to go this far, how he wished he could take it back. But the words rang hollow. Too little. Far too late. I didn't lash out at him. I didn't scream or cry or demand answers he couldn't give. I just looked at him, steady and calm, and said the only thing left to say. "I hope you find a way to make peace with yourself, Chase. But I'm done. And with that I closed the door. The victory wasn't in the money. It wasn't in the house or the accounts or the possessions. The victory was in standing up for myself, in refusing to let their betrayal define me, in knowing that my grandfather's memory had been honored, that his wishes had been restored, that the truth had prevailed. And as I walked back into my home, into the life I had fought so hard to reclaim, I felt the weight lift. I had chosen peace. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when the house is still and the world outside has settled into that soft, muted hush of late evening, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about everything that's happened. The storm has long passed now. The court battles, the tension, the public unraveling of my family's carefully crafted facade. And yet, echoes of it remain. Ghosts of what was lost and what was won. I suppose that's the thing no one tells you about justice. It's never as simple as right and wrong, win or lose. There are victories that taste sweet, yes, but they come laced with sorrow, with a quiet ache of what might have been. When the final gavel fell in that courtroom, when the judge's words restored what had been taken from me, I felt relief wash over me like a tide. It was a relief so profound I think I'll feel its aftershocks for the rest of my life. For so long I had lived under the shadow of what they did. The betrayal, the theft, the erasure of my worth. I had fought with every ounce of strength I had, not just for the inheritance my grandfather intended for me, but for my own dignity, my own truth. And I had won. The financial stability that came with the verdict gave me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long: peace of mind. It wasn't just about the money, though yes, it meant security, a future I could build without fear of sudden ruin, the ability to breathe without worrying about the next bill or unexpected emergency. But more than that, it was about standing on my own 2 feet, knowing that I had faced the storm and come through it. I'd fought not with cruelty, not with spite, but with the truth. And the truth had set me free. I used some of the inheritance to buy a modest home, not the grand Victorian I'd once dreamed of, not the house that Chase had tried to claim, but something that felt entirely mine. A place filled with light, with space for a garden out back where I could plant the roses my grandfather loved so much. A place where I could build new memories, untainted by the bitterness of what came before. And yet, if I'm honest, the victory didn't erase the scars. I'd be lying if I said it did. There are still moments when I think about my parents, about Chase, and feel that familiar sting of hurt. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor, the place you can turn to when the world gets too loud, too heavy. Mine became the storm itself. And that kind of wound doesn't disappear overnight. There are days when I wonder what it would have been like if things had been different. If my parents had chosen integrity over greed. If Chase had chosen loyalty over envy. If we had stood together as a family should, instead of tearing each other apart. But those are just daydreams now. Flickers of a reality that never came to pass. And I've learned not to dwell on them for too long. Because here's the truth I've come to understand. Revenge, even when it's righteous, even when it's driven by justice, doesn't heal the hurt. It doesn't fill the empty places left behind by betrayal. What it does, what it can do, is offer closure. A way to draw a line under the past and say, this is where it ends. This is where I begin again. And that, I think, is where I find my peace. Not in seeing Chase brought low, not in watching my parents' schemes unravel, but in knowing that I didn't let their choices define me. That I chose honesty, strength, and dignity in the face of their lies. That I didn't just survive what they did. I rose above it. Chase tried once or twice to make amends. Small gestures. A card at Christmas. Unsigned but clearly from him. A donation in my grandfather's name to a charity he used to support. But the damage was done. The bridge was burned, and while forgiveness might come in time, maybe, reconciliation is another matter entirely. Some things, once broken, can't be made whole again. I've come to terms with that. I've found my own family now, in friends who stood by me through the worst of it, in neighbors who welcomed me with kindness, in the quiet strength I've discovered in myself. And that's enough. When I tell my story, and I do when people ask when they need to hear it, I don't tell it as a tale of revenge. I tell it as a reminder that we all have choices. That even when those closest to us betray us, even when the people we should be able to trust most show us their worst selves, we can choose our own ending. We can choose to stand up, to fight for what's right, to carve out a future on our own terms. So if you're listening, if you found yourself trapped in a web of toxic family dynamics, know this: you're not powerless. You're not alone. And you can choose your own ending. It might not look the way you once imagined. It might not heal every wound. but it can be yours. And that, in the end, is the greatest victory of all. These days I spend my time building that future. The garden out back is blooming now, full of color and life. The house is warm, filled with books, laughter, and the quiet contentment of a life reclaimed. I think Grandpa would be proud. I think he'd smile to see me here, steady and strong, honoring his memory not with bitterness, but with resilience. Justice came at a price. But it also brought me peace. And for that I'm grateful.